Welcome to our last spotlight session, and the first speaker is Luis Ortiz, who's going to talk about causal strategic inference in network microfinance economies.
Okay, good morning. So I'm here solving for my student, Irfan, who unfortunately wasn't able to get the visa. This is kind of a pity because this is work that is very close, he was passionate about. He's from Bangladesh, and most of you may know the microfinance movement actually was born in Bangladesh, but was introduced by a young economic professor at the time, Muhammad Yunus. And at the time they started with 42 people, and by now we have about 100 million people being served by microfinance. In fact, him and the organization that he created, what's called the Grameen Bank, were given the Nobel Prize about 2 or 3 years ago, or some time ago. So let me say a little bit about microfinance markets. Everything that I know about a microfinance market, actually, I learned from Muhammad. They're very, very peculiar. So essentially, there's a small amount of money given to people, and they share responsibility for repayment. Now, you would think that repayment would be low, but in fact, repayment is almost 100%. That means bank recovers almost all the money they actually give out. 99.46%, by the way. So another thing that is interesting is that the banks or the microfinance institutions, or MFIs, as they call them, they're not for profit, and they're usually government subsidized. So what are we interested in here? So we're interested in trying to understand, so we want to design models and algorithms that allow us to understand the stability of these systems, and also to perform what we call causal strategic inference. And I'm not going to go into the detail. The idea is to provide tools to decision makers to do policy making. And you can come to the poster to talk about. Now, our modeling approach actually, it's similar to what Michael presented earlier. So it's a graphical model in a different context. So in this context, we have a bipartite market. Banks serve certain regions. We treat not individuals, but villages as a whole, and each one have access to different banks. Banks can control the interest rates, and they want to essentially, they act as market makers. They want to set the interest rate so that supply meets demand, and they can distribute their loans. And the villages just want to get as much money as they can to produce as much as they can, subject to recovering and being able to repay, okay? So I won't get into the details. We go through several technical, mathematical, and computational results, systems of equilibria, all those sort of things. I'm just going to leave you with a last point that I found very interesting. So we actually learned our model from real data, and from Bangladesh with 464 villages, which was quite large. In that case, just 1 second. Our prediction was 13.5% equilibrium rate, which was different from the interest rates that they actually had. This was in 2005. A couple of years later, their regularization authority set up the interest rate to 13.5%. So I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, details are the poster. We have the next speaker, David Eigen, who's going to talk about depth map prediction from a single image.
Okay, yep, thanks. So this is joint work with Christian Porsche and Rob Fergus, also at NYU. Okay, so the goal of our work is to take a single RGB image and from that predict a depth map that contains for each pixel the depth from the camera for the point in the scene in that pixel. So here we've got an example where the predicted depth is blue, where the image is closer up, like for the table and chairs, and for the points in the scene that are further back, like the wall, it's in red. Now, the way we do that is using a multi-scale convolutional network, and that combines both a global view of the scene along with local view. And the global view gets the overall depth structure, while the local views are able to align to the image details and provide edits for some of the objects or things that are at a finer scale. And the way we do this is basically by taking the RGB image, feeding that into a convolutional network with multiple layers of convolutions and pooling down to a fully connected layer that incorporates the features from the full image and produces a prediction over the entire image. And this captures a lot of the overall structure of the scene. We then align this further to the details in the image to get better depth transitions along the edges by taking that map and concatenating it with features that are pulled from the original image at a finer stride with less pooling. And this together, these concatenated maps go through additional convolutions, and this is going to take that core scale prediction and align it with the finer scale features. Now, this stands a little bit in contrast to the stereo case, where in stereo you can just use local features to get disparities. Here, for the single image case, we found it was pretty important to look at the entire scene with a wide field of view and make that full prediction first. So we've got a few examples here. For each, we're showing the RGB image input, the depth map prediction predicted by our network, as well as the ground truth depth maps on the right. So you can see that our predictions in the middle are incorporating a lot of the overall structure, as well as aligning to a lot of the edges and the chairs and the desks, and getting better depth transitions for those details. And that's about it. We've got some code for inference online with pre-trained models, and some the predictions also on that URL there. Our poster is 29. Hope to see you there. Thanks.
Next, we'll have Jan Drugowitsch, who's going to talk about optimal decision-making with time-varying evidence reliability.
Thanks. So this is joint work with Moreno-Bote and Alexandre Pouget. Our work investigates the question of optimality in perceptual decision-making under increasingly realistic scenarios. And the basic idea is that perceptual decision-making is usually performed in two stages. First, you would accumulate perceptual evidence over time to increase the certainty about the hidden state that you want to estimate. And second, you would terminate this accumulation to perform not only accurate, but also fast decisions. A simple example would be estimating the landing point of a return in tennis, where first you would observe the trajectory of the incoming ball to get a better estimate of its landing point. Once you have a good enough estimate, you would terminate the accumulation to commit to a decision. In this case, you would be running to the left. Previous work has mostly focused on the case where the reliability of the evidence remained constant within individual decisions. In tennis, this would correspond to the idea that you have the same amount of evidence about the landing point of the ball when it just left the opponent's racket as when it has already crossed the net. This is clearly unrealistic, and so we introduced a novelty in our work that we actually allow the reliability to vary even within individual decisions. And to that respect, we asked two questions. The first is, what is the optimal strategy that maximizes the decision-maker's reward rate? And we find the strategy by dynamic programming applied to POMDPs, where we borrow concepts from stochastic optimal control to keep the whole thing tractable. And it turns out that this strategy is given by two reliability-dependent bounds on the decision-maker's belief, where if the belief remains within these two bounds, you would continue to accumulate evidence, but once you hit either of those two bounds, you would trigger the corresponding decision. The bound shape itself depends on one hand on the statistics of the reliability time course, on the right shown for different speeds with which this reliability changes over time, and on other task contingencies. The second question we asked is, does it actually make sense to really follow this more complicated strategy? And how does it perform in comparison to more simple heuristics such as the standard diffusion model or, let's say, reliability independent bands? So we find that in both cases, these heuristics feature a more than 50% drop in reward rate when compared to the optimal strategy for different environmental statistics. So to summarize, we don't only outline the optimal strategy for decision-making based on perceptual evidence under increasingly realistic scenarios, we also show under which conditions the model's predictions can be experimentally tested, and we give you an idea how to improve your tennis. That should be reasons enough to come to our poster. Thanks.
Next up is Kaustup Patil, who's going to tell us about optimal teaching for limited capacity human learners.
This is joint work with Zhao Xinsu, Lukasz Kopes, and Bradley Lau. Our aim here is to find good training sets so that are useful for training humans. We look at the category learning category structures, and we can either do that using IID sets or idealized set. So recent work in psychology tells us that actually the idealized set, which have like lower variance within categories, are more useful for humans. When humans learn categories, they store specific examples in the memory, and then they're retrieved at the decision time and compared to the new items. This retrieval process is not perfect and has a limited capacity, so that only a few examples can be retrieved. Also, this process is noisy. So this puts the limitations on decision making. So when we know that, how can we exactly find good training sets so that only good examples are stored in the memory and help at the test time? We use the optimal teaching framework for this and devise a continuous optimization problem to teach something called as GCM, that is the generalized context model, which is commonly used in psychology as a model for categorization. We parameterize GCM in two ways. In one way, it works as a low-capacity human learner, and in other way, it's a high-capacity learner, which is closer to a machine learning system. We find optimal training set for these two scenarios. So one is shown as the black circles, which is the optimal training set for the low-capacity learner, and it turns out to be idealized, so it has a low variance within its own category. The other training set are for the high-capacity learner and also IID training sets. The curves show the estimated performance for the low-capacity learner on this different training set, and they predict that humans should perform the best when trained on the low-capacity optimal training set. We performed experiments on 600 human participants from Mechanical Turk and compared their performance with the low-capacity and the high-capacity model. We find that humans perform much more similar to the low-capacity model than the high-capacity model. And also they perform significantly better when trained on the optimal training set for the low-capacity model when compared to the IID sets. We also quantified their inconsistency in classifying the neighboring test items and find that the test inconsistency is lower when they were trained on the optimal training set for the low capacity. So this adds more evidence to the low capacity account of human category learning. So that's it. Thank you very much, and see you at our poster.
Next up is Volodymyr Mnih talking about recurrent models of visual attention.
Hello, this is joint work with Nicholas Heess, Alex Graves, and Kore kavukcuoglu from Google DeepMind. So convolutional neural nets are currently state-of-the-art on many standard computer vision data sets. But they have one undesirable property, and that is the fact that they process the entire input at the same resolution, and because of that, the amount of computation they perform increases with the size of the input image. So we present a model that can process images and videos more efficiently, but by deciding which parts of the input to process at high resolution. So the model is a recurrent neural network that at each step obtains a multi-resolution crop of the input. It extracts information from this crop and uses it to update its internal representation of what's in the input. Then it outputs the next location to process. This continues for some number of time steps until the model makes a prediction about the image or video using the information accumulated from multiple fixations. So because we use the cropping operation, this model isn't differentiable, and we can't train it directly with backprop. What we do instead is use reinforcement learning to train the policy for where to look. So this allows us to train the model end-to-end and to learn task-specific policies. So now, unlike convolutional neural nets, the number of parameters and the amount of computation the model does can be controlled independently of the size of the input. So we evaluated our model on cluttered and jittered digit classification tasks. And we found that compared to convnets with a similar number of parameters, this model scales better to large inputs and is more robust to clutter. So here are some examples from the policy learned for classifying these translated cluttered digits. So the column on the left shows 4 test cases, And we showed the sequence of glimpse location that the model made as overlaid in green. The next 6 columns showed the multi-resolution crops that the model chose to do on these test cases. So we see that the model learns to quickly find the digit in order to classify it. So if this sounds interesting, come to our poster for more details and some results on synthetic videos. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Pietro Vertechi, who is going to tell us about unsupervised learning of an efficient short-term memory network.
So the poster I'm going to be presenting is joint work with William Brendel under the supervision of Christian Machens. Our main focus of interest is self-organization in neural networks. In simpler words, we would like to understand how neurons can learn to cooperate for a global objective, such as, for example, short-term memory, which we'll analyze in fuller detail. We start from first principles. So from a given computational problem, we define an appropriate objective function. Then, by minimizing such function, we are able to derive the optimal connectivity for a recurrent neural network to solve the task. However, in a biological network, such precise connectivity needs to be learned with biologically plausible learning rules that ideally should only rely on locally available biophysical quantities. This is a, in general, complicated problem, and to tackle it, we came up with a framework that we call lazy distributed computing, in which we were able to find a strong link between the computational elements that follow from our derivation and well-known biological features of cortical circuitry. So, obviously, the computational units of the model correspond to neurons, whose voltage, the membrane potential, should be encoding the neuron's perception of a global error. When this error becomes too big, then the neuron should spike to reduce it. And of course, as the error gets reduced, all other units should update their error estimate, which we believe can be done through a mechanism of lateral inhibition. When the network is performing well, then the error will be small, and as a consequence, so will the membrane potential, which corresponds to the widely known balance of excitation and inhibition in cortical neurons. By using this new framework, we were able to derive a voltage-dependent synaptic plasticity rule that, starting from a random network, converges to the optimal connectivity we derived. If you are interested or a little skeptical, please come and discuss more at poster number 10. Thank you.
Thank you, and this concludes the spotlight session.
And this concludes this part of NIPS. The technical program is over. We just have posters left for this afternoon. We thank you, all the speakers. We thank you, all you participants, and we hope you'll enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Yeah. And so it's over to Francis Bark and Amir Globerson, who've handled the excellent workshop program for tomorrow. Okay, thanks very much for everyone again.